Tonight, we are going to ask a question that I think is an important question as we begin the early voting time here in Marion County and leading up to voting day in November. And that question is, what is a community? What's the difference between cities that are collections of homes and businesses and cities that are genuine communities? The last forum in this series described the systems that we've developed here in Indianapolis, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, to govern Indianapolis. That forum tried to answer a different question. What does Indianapolis look like today? What's its structure? How do we elect the people who manage the services that we expect government to provide? How do we decide what those services are? And not so incidentally, how do we pay for them? Whatever we think about our city, what works well, what doesn't, what isn't getting done, what is getting done that maybe shouldn't be, one fact is inescapable. There are not enough resources to do everything that everyone would like to see our city do. And increasingly, we find ourselves trying to stretch limited dollars just to do the very basic things that all citizens expect. So all cities have to set priorities, and we in Indianapolis are no different. Those priorities need to be informed by those of us who live here. And I want to suggest that those priorities tell the people who live here and the people who might want to move here or start businesses here a lot about us. If we want Indianapolis to be a genuine, healthy community rather than a collection of unrelated inhabitants, if we want to marshal the talents and goodwill of our neighbors in ways that will build on our strengths and compensate for our weaknesses, we need to consider what it takes to create that kind of community. And we need to ask ourselves which of those tasks are properly the job of municipal government. Setting priorities requires us to agree on the elements that make for a good quality of urban life. In an era of scarce resources, that process also requires us to decide which services are essential and which fall under the category of would be really nice if we could afford it. The process of setting priorities requires us to decide what trade-offs are worthwhile and which ones shortchange us as a community. Most of us want to feel safe in our homes and on our streets, but we don't want that security to come at the cost of people's civil liberties. We want to send our city's children to schools that will prepare them for life in the 21st century, that will give them critical thinking skills, even as we disagree about what those schools should look like, because we know that great cities do not exist without great schools and educated populations. We all want government that represents us, that's trustworthy and transparent and responsive to its constituents. Most of us want to live in a city that's inclusive and welcoming, with a citizenry that sees diversity as an opportunity and difference as enriching, rather than a city that is a collection of separate communities walled off from and suspicious of each other. And most of us want the amenities that make cities wonderful places to live and work. Parks and trails, libraries, like the one we're in, museums, great public transportation, clean air and water, well-tended streets, roads and bridges that don't fall down, the social and public infrastructure that facilitates urban well-being. And the question, of course, is how do we pay for all that? And if we can't pay for it all, which of those public goods must take priority? Our panelists have been selected because they are in positions that make them ideally situated to address those questions. Julia Vaughn has been working with Common Cause to fight for good government for many years. She's been a voice for ethical governance and sanity at the Indiana State House and in city. I know somebody just laughed when I said sanity at the State House. And in city halls around the state. Kelly Bentley, who is serving her 4th term as member of the Board of Commissioners of IPS, has been a long-time and ardent supporter of public education and educational reforms that really serve our city's children. Judge David Shahid recently retired from the bench. He has long been one of the most thoughtful observers of issues in the community involving reentry, disadvantaged populations, and diversity in general. Troy Riggs recently left his position as Indianapolis's Director of Public Safety and has a uniquely informed perspective on the issues of crime in our city. Through her work with Health by Design, Kim Irwin has come to understand that civic health involves far more than the physical health of its inhabitants, important as that is. Healthy cities are cities with a great quality of life. And finally, John Ketzenberger of Indiana's Fiscal Policy Institute knows better than most of us the challenges we face in paying for our priorities and funding that very good quality of life. You can read much more about our panelists in the handout you've been given, but I know that hearing from them, you will agree with me that their perspectives on the challenges we face are informed and informative. So without further ado, we will start at this end of the panel and work our way down, and I am turning this over to Julia Vaughn.
Well, thank you, Sheila, and thanks to all of the organizers for this event. It's important for citizens in our community to have the opportunity to come together and discuss important issues, so I really appreciate being included on this panel. I think that really 2015, election is pivotal for the city of Indianapolis when it comes to issues of good government. You know, we can continue along the way that things have gone in this city for a long time, where high-profile deals are made behind closed doors in the dark, and the benefits go to a very small collection of well-connected individuals, yet the risk and the cost is spread out among the entire public. That needs to change. For too long in Indianapolis, those who finance the political campaigns of those who seek to represent us in the mayor's office and at the city county council, and those who lobby the policymakers and decision makers for our city and county government have been able to operate pretty much anonymously, even without the scrutiny and disclosure, as weak as it is, that's required of those same people, lobbyists and campaign contributors at the state level. Unfortunately, the city of Indianapolis doesn't even have requirements that reach the stringency of our very weak state requirements for campaign finance and lobbying disclosure. We have in this city a similar problem that the state has faced and has tried to solve, although they're continuing to search for a solution, and that's with a revolving door that spins between city government and a few businesses that benefit from their close relationship with key staff people in city government. And as taxpayers, we're not sure when they're in their public capacities if they're there for public service or eventual private gain when they leave public employment for a private opportunity that they probably got because of their service to the city. Those things have become commonplace in Indianapolis, and I think they really undermine the public trust. And when we don't have public trust, we don't have civic participation. And unfortunately, our voter turnout levels in this city have really been low. And so when just a small minority of folks are making decisions for the rest of us, as they do when we have single-digit voter turnout levels, we really don't have a community that is engaged at all around civic issues. So hopefully that will change. I'm encouraged that at least there have been some discussions, at least in the form of political commercials, about changing the way that Indianapolis has worked. So we really need a mayor and a city-county council who will not just talk about transparency, but who will really walk the walk of transparency. Because transparency helps to build public trust. So we need to change the way that contracts are done in this city. We need more public bidding. And we need details about contracts before they're signed, not afterwards. We need vetting and information before, not after the fact. We need real lobbying regulation, and that means enforcement. You can't ask folks to voluntarily disclose information and then not verify it. I believe there have been 2 gifts ever disclosed from lobbyists to members of our city-county council. The disclosure system has been in place now for 5 years. I am certain there have been more gifts given than 2, yet that's what's been reported. And there's absolutely nothing to fear by not reporting because there's no enforcement. So we should at least do random audits of a certain percentage of filings. At the state level, it's 10%. And again, the state does not set a high bar. So the least the city of Indianapolis could do would be to replicate. Certainly, our recommendation would be they go further, but at least they should set standards to meet what lobbyists at the state are required because, quite frankly, they're mostly the same people. They just walk from one end of Market Street down to the other end of Market Street. If they have to comply with state regulations, they should also have to comply with similar city regulations. We do have a campaign finance database maintained by the county clerk, but it's even clunkier than the state system. It's not searchable, and it needs to be. You shouldn't have to leaf through page after page of individual campaign finance reports to figure out who's financing the election or re-election efforts for candidates in our community. We need to end the pay-to-play system here in Indianapolis, where it sure looks like those who have the most to profit are the folks who are always anteing up the money for our candidates to use to run for their election. There have been too many situations where it seems like campaign contributions have really helped with contracts. That's a system that looks bad, and it needs to be remedied. We need to shut the revolving door between city government and private contractors and require at least a 1-year cooling off period from folks leaving city government and working as lobbyists or working with a company that they had primary responsibility over contracts or anything involving fiduciary relationships. We need to shut that revolving door. And finally, every 10 years here in Indianapolis, the 2 political parties have fought over redistricting. Citizens have been an afterthought. It's ended up at the Indiana Supreme Court now twice. And redistricting has been used as a political tool by Republicans and Democrats to stack the deck to increase their chances of re-election. That's an issue that the state is grappling with now as well. So the city should go to our state legislature and say, as you're talking about reforming redistricting for yourself, you should also reform it at the local level. Now, they don't have to ask for permission from the state. They could do this voluntarily. So in 2022, let's hope that we have redistricting that considers communities of interest and their needs here in Indianapolis, not just the partisan political needs of the two major political parties. So thanks for the opportunity. I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you. I think the last session that they held, they talked a little bit about government and how it's structured in Indianapolis. And one of the clunkiest parts of government in Indianapolis is the school systems. I'm not sure, I can't see everybody, and this isn't one of my questions, but how many people can name one of their school board members? Anybody? I guess a few. Well, you would, because you're related to one. But, you know, there are 11 school corporations in Marion County, public school corporations in Marion County, and then we also have public charter schools. That's a lot of elected school boards. That's a lot of systems to have to navigate if you really want to figure out what's going on. I am on the school board in Indianapolis Public Schools. I don't pretend to have all the answers for all 11 school corporations, but I can certainly talk about some of the challenges that Indianapolis Public Schools is facing. And I think those challenges impact the city in ways that can be negative, but then I also think that there are a lot of positive things on the horizon as well to change things in the city. When I was first elected to the IPS school board back in 1998, a long time ago, I really believed passionately that the school system could be reformed from within. I went through the district. I'm from a public school family where my stepbrothers went through the district, my sister, my children, my niece and nephew are there now. And I really believed that my kids had a great education, and so did I. Everybody can have that same great education. And there's some excellent schools and programs in the district, and there are excellent teachers and principals. But what I learned really quickly, and I don't want to sound cynical, but it's going to sound this way, is that much of what is good in education, whether it's in Indianapolis Public Schools, in Carmel Public Schools, in Washington Township or Perry Township, it's that the schools are excellent often in spite of, not because of, they're part of a school system. And in IPS, the system tends to be, be sort of a large bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily support innovation or excellence or change, for that matter. And it's a struggle. And these are not issues that IPS is dealing with alone. I mean, I think change is difficult in government or in any type of government. I think change is difficult, but education change is especially hard because you're dealing with children. You're dealing with parents that all went to school, so they're all experts, and I consider myself one of those too. But everybody's an expert because we all went to school. And there were children involved. And also people often have loyalties to their schools and to their, because they had a good experience there and they don't necessarily perceive that there are any changes that need to occur. So that is a huge challenge, I think, in changing how school districts operate, because you're dealing with a lot of emotions. But the bottom line is for Indianapolis to be a great city, we have to have strong, healthy neighborhoods. And we can't have strong, healthy neighborhoods unless we have great public schools in every one of them. And right now, there are vast deserts in Indianapolis, IPS specifically, where there are not quality options for families to choose from. And so it's just really important that we focus on making sure that we have great schools in every neighborhood, for our families. because we're not going to strengthen our neighborhoods without them. I think that, we're in an era of school choice, and parents can vote with their feet more than ever before. There's so many public school options in the way of charter schools. There's private school options. There's, I'm just throwing these things out here. I'm not taking a position one way or the other because there are challenges involved with all of them. But now we have the largest voucher program in the country in Indiana, and so people are going to vote with their feet. So schools have to adapt to change. They have to be willing to change. People within districts have to do that, and it's very difficult to do. On a positive note, I feel really confident in what's going on in the district where I serve on the board. Earlier this year, we unanimously supported a core commitment statement as a school board, and it basically flips the pyramid. It puts the emphasis where it belongs, which is on great schools, leaders, school principals, teachers, students, and families, and less so on the top of the pyramid. So it's flipping that pyramid and putting the schools at the top. Some of the other key components of those core commitments is driving more decision-making and autonomy to the school level and making it real building-based decision-making. Parallel to that is creating a weighted student funding formula so that funds coming into the school district are then sent out to the schools based on the students they have. Right now, it's very difficult for the district to determine whether there's any equity in the district, how we're spending our money, because everything is accounted for centrally. And so it's very much a challenge to make sure that we're being equitable in how we're spending our resources. And so moving towards a weighted student funding system will help ensure that, and it'll make it, going back to what Julia said, it makes it much more transparent. You'll be able to see exactly how schools or how districts are spending their money and how individual schools are spending their money. There was a panel discussion in this room a couple of years ago where one of the panelists, who is from IUSPIA, who is an expert at government finance, and knows something about school finance. There are very few that do. I'm not one of them. But who said, we spend half of our state budget on education, and no one knows how the money is spent. And it's true. You can say, well, the majority of it goes to teacher salaries, or staff salaries. Well, that's true. But knowing who those people are and how you're actually spending the money is huge. Some of the specific challenges in IPS, I was just reading the kids, there was an article in the paper today, kids counts put out their 2015 data book. And there's been an 81% increase of students living in poverty, or homeless students in Marion County. I mean, that's huge. And we see increases of students living in poverty year after year after year. Huge increases in students where English is not their primary language. These things aren't insurmountable. But there are challenges that have to be addressed in order for those students to be successful. And I might add that having, it also makes for a more interesting population, I think, especially when we have students where English isn't their primary language. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it requires additional resources for those students in order for them to be successful. We're seeing huge increases in the number of students that are living in poverty. Huge increases, or not huge, but increases in the students that need special education services. And all of those things cost more money. And then we're going to talk, I think, probably about public safety. And, safety in schools is a huge issue. And that was one thing that, the funding for school safety was cut this last legislative session at a time when we need to make sure our schools are safe. IPS, has its own police department. I want to say it's the third largest in the county, but I could be wrong. And, we spend a significant amount of money on that police department. Those are general education dollars that are being spent on that police department. Dollars that were intended for educating children, but you got to educate children in a safe environment. And so it's important that, we be able to provide that kind of security to our students and families. We get, 60 cents on the dollar to cover costs like special education costs. And so all of those additional costs are borne by, by the general ed fund. And so it becomes kind of a push-pull on, how you're going to prioritize your spending. But I think that, one of the things that I feel really passionately about is that we have to rethink how we structure education, not just to make, not just so that kids do better academically, but because we're not going to have we're not going to have the funds long-term, to fund the systems as they exist today. So, go ahead.
Well, Sheila, thank you for inviting me to be part of this important discussion, and I'm very grateful to the organizers. And actually, thanks to Kelly, because she made my job a little easier because she introduced a subject I really want to talk about. My comments are basically based upon my experience as a Superior Court judge for about 20 years. I'm currently serving as a senior judge in one of the protective order courts, so I can imagine you would expect me to talk about crime and how to reduce crime, but what I really want you to think about for a few minutes is education. What I've learned from this job and what researchers also document is that without education, in particular a high school diploma, one is more likely to be one of the 700,000 Americans that are incarcerated in some form across the United States or under some form of court supervision. When we connect the dots, which shows us that if we do a better job in the education arena, we can reduce that number. But the quality of schools has an impact on our community in other ways. When we look at the residential construction in Center Township, the buildings that are going up, residential and commercial, we know that in particular, if you want to attract young people downtown into those neighborhoods, those residences, you have to be able to answer both safety issues and issues with respect to where their children are going to be educated, the quality of schools. Private schools are an answer, but they're not the total answer. When the mayor of this city and other cities try to attract industry to our community, the CEOs that are making relocation decisions want to know about safety and crime issues, but they also want to know about the quality of schools that will be available to their employees. In addition, they want to know where will the skilled workforce come from, the educated workforce that will fill some of the jobs that they're going to be able to offer. So my focus on this issue is probably shaped by the fact that I have two daughters that are involved in education issues, one from a policy standpoint and one who is an educator currently in Mexico as she prepares to open the first dual language Spanish immersion elementary school in Marion County next year. So I'm aware that the education issue as well as the criminal justice issue is infinitely complex. And there's no silver bullet, quick solution to this problem. Teachers and educators are on the front line of some of our most difficult problems facing our community. October this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So if a child is in a home where domestic violence is taking place, do you think that they can focus on math facts? Yet, teachers in Marion County, in IPS, have to deal with children that are coming from those kind of environments. Indiana falls around the national average of 15.9% food insecurity for all Americans, In Marion County, rates can reach as high as 19.2%. So if a child is wondering about their next meal, and we know about, school lunch and free lunch programs and so forth, but if a child is wondering about where they're going to eat that evening, can they really pay attention to classwork in the same way that your child can? Recent studies show that girls stay in juvenile detention longer than boys because the home that they come from is not safe for them. Again, school and instruction is interrupted, and the pace of education instruction today is so intense. When do these young people that are taken out of the school and are in juvenile detention, when do they catch up? And when do they get on par with the rest of their classmates? I point out these examples to show that this election coming up is not going to be able to fix all of our problems, because it's not merely a situation of allocating more resources to an agency of state government and even to the school system. The Mayor's Charter School Board is an important initiative, and more mayors are taking an interest in the public schools in their neighborhood for the reasons that I've just outlined. So those issues are important for us to consider with respect to the upcoming election and also with respect to the quality of life in our communities. At this point, I'm going to more or less depart from the election piece and really focus on an issue that I try to do when I am allowed an opportunity to have talks of this type, basically with the public, to speak in a more personal way, because this is our community. And each of us, like it or not, have a role to play in the quality of life in our community. And I ask all of us, when is the last time that we visited the public school in our neighborhood? When is the last time that we asked what we could do to make that school better? Now, I know just from my experience with teachers, in particular in IPS, the resources that they have to work with are not enough. I can still remember finding out that some of the IPS teachers were buying supplies for some of their students because they didn't have them. So each of us could play a role, no matter how small, in making the schools in our neighborhood more effective and more resourceful by just asking that question. But in conclusion, I want to mention a term that I recently heard of that also speaks to our individual opportunity and challenge to make our community better, and that is the acronym CCA, a consistent, caring adult. And one of the things when you work in the courts, as long as I have, you recognize that there are a lot of individuals, in particular in the criminal justice system, that have never had in their lives a constant, caring adult. When we started reentry court in 2005, and for those who don't know, the main difference between reentry court and probation or parole is that the judge and a small staff of people take an interest in the inmate that has returned back to the community. They come to court basically once or twice a month, depending upon how recently they've been released, and the judge indicates that as long as the ex-offender does what they're supposed to do, in other words, look for a job, stay off drugs, become a good citizen in the community, myself as a judge will do my part to make sure that they have the resources that they need to stay out of prison and become effective citizens. And essentially, when I look back, what I was doing was playing the role of the CCA, the constant caring adult. And for those of us who have had two parents, or at least one parent or someone around us that has been that constant caring adult, it's very easy for us to take it for granted. But let me conclude with just a small personal anecdote. When I was 17, my father passed suddenly, and that's not the point of this, because by the time he passed, I'd already gotten good values, had a picture of where I wanted to go. I was a little hazy about it in part, but I had kind of a direction to my life, planned to go to college and so forth. But there was a lawyer by the name of Charles Feibelman who became my CCA. And not because there was a Big Brothers program or anything like that, but I guess he just saw a need. And for the 4 years I was in college, he just took the initiative that when I was home from college, he took me to lunch. Asked how I was doing in school. I had an accident. He helped solve that little problem. But the key thing that he did is at the end of my 4 years, he said, "Have you ever thought about law school?" It was, I'd never even considered that I would be able to do law school or anything like that. So I was an athlete, so I knew about people being in Indiana, particularly being interested in basketball players. But when he mentioned law school, I mean, I could have fallen out of my chair. But because I trusted him and because he had been that constant caring adult for 4 years, later when I started to sort out my life and became a little bit more mature, I thought about what Charles Feibelman said. And so don't dismiss the possibilities that you may have in a young person's life by being that constant caring adult. I can tell you from experience, being in the court, there are thousands of people in this community that if they only had that constant caring adult for maybe an hour or two a month, there's no telling what their outcomes may be. But I can guarantee you that just like I had no idea that I might become a judge, those young people who don't have a constant caring adult in their lives will see a potential that you give them just from being in your company. So I want to thank Sheila for inviting me to be here, and look forward to the other panelists.
Thank you, Judge. I'm Troy Riggs, the former Director of Public Safety, now I'm with the IU Public Policy Institute. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the invitation. I want to talk a little bit about public safety and kind of set the stage for what the next mayor is going to inherit in our great city. First of all, you have to realize that sometimes we forget, but Indianapolis is a major city. And when you are a major city and you're at crossroads of America, so to speak, you have major crime issues. You have major drug traffic. You have a lot of things going on that we may not think of occurring in the Midwest, but it certainly does occur here in Indianapolis. I will tell you this, that most of the response from public safety across the nation for the last few decades has been reactive. Arresting people, incarcerating individuals, the broken window theory of locking everyone up in an area that's doing anything remotely wrong, putting them in jail and punishing them that way can have some short-term results, but it can also have long-term consequences. And so there was a unique approach that was developed in January of this year here in the city of Indianapolis, where data was really used to look at the systemic issues that lead to crime. Coming to the realization that crime, in most cases, is not just spontaneous, it's after years of degradation of quality of life issues in many of our cities. And what we found out was pretty startling, that as a community sat down and worked in this together, they came up with some areas of town that 4.7% of our population resides. And before we get lost in numbers, let me just remind you that 4.7% of the population of this great city lives within 8 square miles in these different areas. Just 8 square miles of 400 square miles. 4.7% of the population represents 42,000 fellow Hoosiers, 42,000 neighbors and friends. Doesn't matter what race, doesn't matter what gender. These are human beings that are struggling. And this 4.7% of our neighbors and friends reside in areas where 30% of the homicides take place, where over 30% of non-fatal shootings take place, where violent crime is a real and present danger. In just 8 square miles, 4.7% of the population. But that's not all. We have to look at the systemic issues. If you're a young person, you live in this area, most likely you're hungry. If you reside in these areas, there is an 80% plus likelihood that you do not have the basic skills to get a middle income class job. That as a young person gets off a school bus and walks home, every 4th house is going to be vacant at minimum. That 14% of all mental health runs in the entire city are made where 4.7% of our population lives and resides. These are troublesome numbers. The good news is that this community is unique. I will say this, one of the reasons I want to live in Indianapolis is because you can get in trouble here, but you can get in trouble because you don't collaborate. And people collaborate with one another here. And the city started working together, and there's been tremendous partners. In these areas that some people know as the 6 focus areas, other people call them the 6 intersections. I've told you the numbers, but in these areas, by the end of the year, just 1 year into this, we're not going to make major significant changes because these are generational issues, but just in 1 year, fellow Hoosiers have donated upwards to $1 million for services in these areas. Non-government money, nonprofit money, faith-based organizations. And by the end of the year, there's going to be over 3,000 to 5,000 volunteers that are going to be in these areas. Now, that's some of the issues. You think, why in the world, after listening to some of us speak tonight, would anybody in their right mind want to be mayor of the city of Indianapolis? Because it's still a great city, because we have a lot of opportunities. The answers to our issues are in this room, it's in the community. And I think that's where we need to not only elect a mayor that gets that, but also help the mayor, whether we voted for that individual or not, help the mayor succeed because it's our city. But I want to be very clear about some other issues facing the mayor. Recently, Marian University did a study, and crime rates in Indianapolis, believe it or not, are lower than they've been in many, many years. Property crime has plunged. Violent crime is lower with the exception of homicide. In 2012, there were more shootings than there was in 2014, even though the homicide rate increased by over 30. And you think, how can that be? Well, it can be because during that same time, there was a 20% increase in those committing homicides that had violent criminal backgrounds. In 2012, 72% of all homicide suspects had a criminal history. 80-something% of the victims had a criminal history. 2014, 92% of all those that took another human life had local criminal histories. We didn't check state histories, we didn't check national, just local Indianapolis histories. 92%. And what we found out that these violent offenders were killing witnesses. We have to get our arms around the reentrants that are coming to our cities and causing issues. Now, with that said, we have to be deeply committed to providing first day in services to those young men and young women that are going to prison, to try to help restore them as they come back to the streets of Indianapolis. And they come back at the number of 9,000 this year to the city of Indianapolis. 9,000 reentrants coming back to the city of Indianapolis. A handful, just a handful is driving the homicide rate. That's why you see the FBI helping Chief Hyde and the police department focused on quality arrest and not quantity arrest. These are big issues. And it's incumbent that the next mayor continues to work with the community to address these issues, to make sure that everyone has the opportunities that this great country affords each and every one of our residents. And it's hard work, but it certainly takes the community together to do that. Now, we can have all the best ideas we want. We can have surefire ways of dealing with issues, and believe me, there's no one thing that can solve our issues. It's multiple approaches, consistent, persistent activity around these issues. But one thing's for sure, you have to have money to make things happen. And one of the worst kept secrets, I should say best kept worst secret in the city is that we're out of money. And John, I'm sure, is going to get more in this and is certainly much more knowledgeable at tax structure than I am. But I can tell you that as a director of public safety in the city of Indianapolis, when you look at the general fund, not the total budget, just the general fund, public safety took up 85% of the general fund. 8 divisions, police, fire, and EMS. Police took up half of that, 85%. In 2 years, that's about a $420, $430 million budget. In 2 years, we saved $10 million. 2015, the structural deficit for the city of Indianapolis will be $43 million. Now, you'll see that there's a balanced budget. It's because there's one-time money that's being used to continue us and have a balanced budget. It's about $100 million over the last 4 years. That money runs out in the next couple of years. Jeopardizing our AAA bond rating, making it more expensive as a city, and putting in jeopardy those new police officers we hired. Those are tough discussions that we have to have. Every police officer that you hire as a citizen costs you $125,000. When you talk about hiring 150, 200, you're talking about $18, $20 million. It's doable, but we have to be aware that whenever we increase spending in one area, we have to reduce it somewhere else. Why? Because it's good fiscal management, and number 2, because we're running out of money. I was going to be a little bit more uplifting, or I was going to try to be. There are solutions, though, and I'll end with what I said a moment ago. We're not in bad shape compared to a lot of other cities. Our liabilities that are on the book are not as great as other cities for pension liabilities and so forth. And this city has such a collaborative spirit. The answer is in the community. We just have to be willing to support our mayor when he makes some tough decisions in the coming years. And we need to be supportive. And we can be supportive by being informed, being involved, and offering suggestions. The mayor's going to need our help, regardless if we voted for the individual that's elected or not. It's our city. We all have to work together. Thank you for having me tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm very pleased to be with all of you and my fellow panelists. My name is Kim Irwin. I'm the Director of Health by Design, and I'm going to talk about quality of life broadly. I'm a public health professional, so I'll speak to that through a public health lens, if you will. But you're going to hear in my comments many things that you've already heard, themes that are being interwoven throughout. So when we think about health, when we think about quality of life, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? It's a nebulous concept in many ways, the quality of life part particularly, but I'll lay out a case by which I think health plays a key role in that, and many of the other issues we're talking about tonight do as well. Historically, we have thought of health in terms of individual factors, individual behaviors, individual interventions, individual outcomes. But there's a growing understanding that health happens in a much broader context, one that's shaped by our interpersonal relationships, the institutions in which we live our day-to-day lives, the community in which we live and spend time, and our policy environments broadly. When it comes to our health and our health behaviors, the choices that we make are shaped by the choices we have. We have to be holistic in thinking about health when we think about quality of life. We have to be thinking about physical health, about mental health, about spiritual and social health. We have to be working across settings. So this isn't about just clinical care. This is about our home environments, our work environments, school, the places we worship, and again, the community more broadly. And it's critical that we think about health throughout the lifespan, at all ages, for all people. One of the ways we, at least from a public health standpoint, that we think about quality of life is termed social determinants of health. We talk about things like essentially social determinants of health is the availability of resources to meet day-to-day needs for people. It's about our educational, economic, and job opportunities. It's about our transportation options and the ways we can move around and be mobile. It's about issues of public safety, about crime and violence, social disorder. It's about our social norms and attitudes and things like discrimination and racism and distrust of government. And it's about access to media, emerging technologies, and our ability to engage with people around us. So I'll reiterate what I said. Our health behaviors, our health outcomes are shaped by the choices that we have. Our community shapes our health and our quality of life, and in turn, our health and quality of life shapes our community. You're all probably well aware of the health rankings and the various health stats as they relate to Indianapolis. It's fair to say that generally speaking, we do really poorly. In terms of county health rankings within Indiana, in terms of health factors, Marion County ranks 89th out of 92 counties. In the American Fitness Index, which is just a snapshot of health and fitness factors, we rank 50th out of 50 largest metro areas. We have issues of inequality and disparity. Excuse me. With a recent report you may have heard of through the Fairbanks School of Public Health and the Polis Center at IUPUI that showed up to 10-year gaps in life expectancy in various neighborhoods within Indianapolis. We spend $24 per resident on parks, which is matched in our peer communities by 3 to 5 times that much spending, and in the top-tiered cities by 10 times that much spending. We have poor air quality, and we have poor transit access to jobs. All of these factors combined, things like food insecurity that you've heard about, a third of our children living in poverty, a fifth of all households having severe household problems, which can involve plumbing issues or structural issues, roofing, those types of things. We have issues, right? We know this. What these snapshots, what these rankings don't capture, though, is the momentum around the work that's going on and impacts that are being made, the collaborative spirit of many, many partners, and a recognition, I would say a growing recognition that, sort of what I said before, that many other factors contribute to these health rankings, these health outcomes, than are about genetics or clinical care or that kind of thing. So what's ahead for us in terms of looking forward and for elected officials? Our work that we do through Health by Design is really ensuring that our neighborhood design, our transportation infrastructure, and our public spaces promote physical activity and healthy living. So that's about things like complete streets, if you're familiar, safe routes to school. It's about the upcoming transit referendum and our ability to choose to dedicate more funding to transit so that we can improve access to jobs and mobility for the population at large. It's about Vision Zero, which is a newer approach which says that traffic crash deaths are unacceptable. There is no reason why pedestrians should be being killed, people who walk should be being killed at the rates that they are on our streets, that people involved in motor vehicle crashes at high speeds and that kind of thing, that those deaths are okay. We've essentially, as a population, come to accept traffic crashes, and that's an increasing or there's increasing awareness about the ways that we can combat that and the ways that we can reduce that. But what I'd like to propose is a much broader approach that really looks at what we call policy, systems, and environmental change. It's about a process of change, looking at structural issues, looking at the frameworks in which we approach sort of public safety, public works, education, and all of those things, and understanding that unless we include health in all policies, unless we bring health into the conversation at every level, we won't be able to address these issues. It's been said, and it's true, there's no one way to solve the problems that we face. It takes multidisciplinary collaboration, it takes a long-term view, and again, I would argue that we have to embed considerations about health, about quality of life, about those social determinants into decision-making processes at all levels, across sectors, and across policy areas. I'll leave you with one word that I think is really important in our work, and I try to talk about this when I have the opportunity, and that is intention, right? None of these things, none of the changes that are needed will just happen. The inertia around the status quo is too entrenched, right? We have lots and lots of well-meaning people, dozens, hundreds of organizations that are all trying to work. But the momentum around keeping things the way they are, or I should say the inertia around keeping things the way they are is really significant. And so it's imperative that our elected officials, new, returning, and really on all of us to make a point to be intentional about change. We certainly need innovation, but I would argue that in many ways we need to go back to the basics. We need to look at fundamental issues. We need to look at history. We need to look at sort of the way our cities were built and operated going back, many decades ago, and really make a commitment to investing in the long term. I think we need to expect that of our elected officials, and we all have a role to play in doing that. Thank you.
Okay.
John gets to tell us how to pay for all this.
I think you know the answer to that. And Sheila, you said I was going to hit cleanup, but here I am where I usually was in the lineup. So actually, I was usually hit 6 or 7 or 8. Good evening. Oh, come on. I mean, you let Kim down completely, so at least, shake it out. Come on. Good evening. Thank you. That's better. My name is John Ketzenberger, and I'm with the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute, which means numbers, and so it is dangerous to put me at the end, and I will make sure that any numbers I give you, I will try to put in context, and I will try to keep them at a minimum, and I will be short because I think you probably want to participate in this as well, and I want to hear what you have to think too. The Fiscal Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We don't take sides. We don't advocate a position. I think that's important to have in mind. Sheila asked me to talk about, and I'm going to take these things off so I can actually read, bifocals, be damned, to talk about a couple things. And I think it's important to understand 4 things. I'm going to talk about the city's budget in very broad terms. I'm going to talk about where the money comes from and where the money goes in broad terms. I want to talk about how Indianapolis relates to the state and vice versa for kind of context purposes. I want to talk about how property tax caps have affected the city. And then finally, I want to talk about some of those areas for how we might have additional money to pay for additional programs or additional spending. And we'll get to that point in just a couple of minutes. So, in terms of the budget, Indianapolis has a $1 billion budget, and as Troy had indicated, there is a structural, there is a deficit in the budget this year and for the last several years, and you can trace that back to the property tax caps, among other measures, despite efforts to rein in costs. Nothing is less expensive than it was before. The revenue for the state, or for the city rather, comes in large part from property taxes, which is not a surprise, and local option income taxes. And those taxes, the local option income taxes, are assessed on the people who live in Marion County, as opposed to people who may come to Marion County, work here. Their taxes are accrued to their home county. So the local option income taxes collected in Indianapolis are from people who live in Indianapolis and work here. So of that 62% in taxes, $318 million is property tax this year. $258 million is the local option income tax, which is a mix of actually 3 different taxes that the state allows counties to collect. All 92 counties have some form of local option income tax now. These taxes were part of the initial attempt to institute property tax reform in the early 1970s and have grown in complexity and commonality in the time since. But most recently, probably in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had some growth in local option income taxes. So that's where the money comes from. Where does the money go? Well, let me give you a couple other numbers that I think are important to remember, because we think of Indianapolis as a single entity. With the combined city-county council or city-county government, we think of Indianapolis as one entity when it comes to taxation. The assessed valuation of the property that can be taxed in Marion County is almost $37 billion. If you take out the incorporated cities, Lawrence, Speedway, Beech Grove, and Southport, it's still it's only about $2 billion in those 4 places. So when we think of Indianapolis in terms of taxation, it's really the city of Indianapolis and not those unincorporated areas. That's what we're talking about. And then just for fun, for complexity's sake, I think it's important to note that there are 66 different taxing entities in Marion County, 66 places that can get their hand into your pocket and draw some money out to use. That's pretty tough to get a handle on, and it's pretty tough to follow. And it's part of the problem, I think, when people talk about taxes being too high or not enough spending on one program or another. It's a very opaque system because it's just hard to get your hands around 66 taxing districts. Everything from sanitation districts to transportation districts to fire, police, just the general property tax, every township. That's a lot of the libraries. That's a lot of things to try to keep track of. And so when you think about taxes, you're inclined to think, well, they're too darn high. Well, maybe they are, but until we understand all of these different areas and their relative importance, it's hard to come to grips with that. So it's a very difficult system and could use a good streamlining, I might add. So I told you I don't advocate, and that's true for the Fiscal Policy Institute. I'm not the Fiscal Policy Institute in that last moment. We need to streamline our property tax system. So the money goes to, as Troy said, the vast majority of the money goes to, and I'm talking about the overall budget, not just the general fund, goes to public safety. In the overall budget, it's 37%. You throw the criminal justice system on top of that, and we're looking at 59% of every dollar spent, 59 cents of every dollar spent in this county, in Indianapolis, is for public safety or criminal justice. That's the lion's share. We spend 9% of our money on debt service, 8% on the administration of the county, and then the other 24% is what you would think of in terms of general government, roads, some of the capital projects, the government at large, that kind of structure. So those are the broad numbers for where we spend our money. And we'll spend in this year $1.033 or $1,033 million. And we have revenue from taxes and other areas of about $992 million. And so then you can see where the deficit comes in. The next thing I want to talk about is the relationship between Indianapolis and the rest of the state. This report that we did is getting a little bit old, but the point is still the same. We were asked to look at the relationship of each county in terms of all of the tax money that it sends to the state of Indiana in the form mostly of sales tax, but also income tax and others, and then how much each county gets back in terms of services, whether it's for education or welfare or anything else that the state sends back in terms of payments to the county. And the reason we did this, this was something that Governor Daniels was very interested in, because he understood, and most economists understood what the answer to this question was, and it was very simple. But the legislature in Indiana has a long-held belief that rural counties subsidize urban counties. And so we wanted to take a look at that, and it was a difficult thing to do because there are so many accounts. We went through more than 550 accounts paid into each of these counties. So we looked at the amount coming from each county to the state and the amount that the state sent back to each county, and simply made a net, and netted that out. And as any economist and the governor then knew, the opposite of what the conventional wisdom was is true. And that's because our larger metropolitan areas are the centers for commerce. And so Vanderburgh County had a situation where on a per capita basis, more than $1,350 in taxes came to Indianapolis than actually went back to the county in services. It's very simple. Vanderburgh County's largest city is Evansville, and Evansville is the center for commerce for not just southwest Indiana, but also southeast Illinois and northwest Kentucky. So if you were going to go to the store and buy something, you would do it most likely in Evansville. The reason this is important, and Marion County, by the way, also sent more to the state than it receives in services by about $500 per person. The reason this is important is because I think it shows the disconnect between what the evidence shows and the attitudes that we see from the people who are making policy decisions in the General Assembly. And we see that all the time. Kim mentioned transportation. You know, the legislature barely allowed Marion County to hold a referendum on whether or not it wanted to determine whether to spend more money on transportation, and then wholesale allowed Allen County more money. It just gave them more money for improved transportation in Allen County. It's inconsistent, and it's the reality that has to be dealt with. But I guess what I'm saying is that evidence doesn't matter, and that's a little disturbing. And then finally, I want to talk just a little bit about the tax caps. The tax caps were enacted by the legislature by law in 2008. Indiana, because it didn't understand, and this goes back to that opaque nature of taxes, in our infinite wisdom, you can't blame me, I voted against the referendum. I wish more of us Hoosiers had voted against the referendum. But now we've enshrined the property tax caps in our Constitution, which means that the legislature, even if it wants to, has a lot of difficulty dealing with tax policy. And that happened in 2010. Already we're seeing problems because, one, the tax caps law was fairly arbitrary in the way it was written, and two, circumstances have changed. And we're trying to adjust to those changes where the Constitution says you can only do so much. Some people may think that's a good idea. As a policy observer, I think that's a terrible idea. I think the legislature should have the flexibility to change its mind if circumstances change. Because remember, it was in 2008 when we enacted these property tax caps. And it was also when the economy was going into the Great Recession. And that really affected cities' abilities to do what they felt like needed to be done. And a lot of cities across the state are hurting pretty badly as a result of the property tax caps. So the property tax caps amount to 1% on the assessed valuation of your home. So for instance, if you have a $100,000 home, you won't pay more than $1,000 in property taxes because it's 10% of, I'm sorry, that's not right. It's $10,000 because you don't pay more than 1%. I was right the first time. Yeah, numbers, man, they're great, aren't they? I didn't write that part down. I was trying to riff, and look what happens. So on your home, it's 1%. On commercial properties, it's 2%. And on industrial properties, it's 3%. Those are the caps. And what that means in practical terms for Marion County is that the county will collect $44 million less in property tax this year than it otherwise would have without those caps. That's arguably a good thing. As a property owner, I'm happy to save some money on my property tax. But from a budgetary purpose and for the purposes of a city going forward, it makes it very difficult to administer and to pay for programs that people want. And I think that people need to understand that while taxes are expensive, you have to look at the relative value you get for those, and that discussion never seems to happen. So the last thing I want to address is, what does this mean for the resources to pay for programs? And as we've established, we're already in a deficit position. Policymakers have to decide what to cut, and a lot of things are mandated, so there's not a lot of places to cut. If we want more money to pay for more things in this county, one of four things have to happen. We have to have more jobs that pay more money so that we can collect more of that county option income tax. We have to have more development so that the assessed valuation of the county goes higher and you can collect more property tax. You can raise the local option income taxes. There's not a lot of room there for the county, but we could raise some of those local option income taxes and use that money that's generated from the tax increase to pay for more programs. Ask Mayor Ballard, ask Mayor Peterson, ask any mayor how that goes, and that's a difficult thing to do. Or we could ask the legislature for some consideration on certain areas. So Marion County has an optional sales tax to pay for the stadium and some other things in these sports districts. In order for the city to be able to do that, it has to go to the state and get approval. There are other taxes like that that the city could ask the state to increase, for permission to increase, and including for transportation and other things. That's a very difficult thing to do. The legislature is loath to do that. On the one hand, they're all for home rule. On the other hand, they don't want you to do anything that might cost them an election. And raising taxes might cost them an election. And then the other thing is you could look at the way local option income taxes are distributed. You'll remember earlier I said it's the county of residence. So there are an awful lot of people who work in Marion County but live in one of the surrounding counties. That option income tax distribution goes to the county that they live in. There has been some talk about changing the way that distribution is made. And I think that there is some more momentum for that than there has been in recent years, but it's still a long way off. But if that formula is changed, then Marion County would probably realize an additional tax revenue as a result. So those are the things that I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
I'm interested to hear what questions you have for us. I appreciate the opportunity, Sheila, and let's get on with it.
Well, can we give all of the panelists a round of applause? And if we can turn up the lights a little, those of you with questions, we have people with microphones who will come and give you a microphone so that you can ask the questions of the panelists. Let there be light. No, there.
Hi, I'm Ethan. So you said there was a $43 million deficit this year, or $41 million? Okay. So what's the surplus that the state has kept saying it has over and over again?
It's about $2 billion, well, a little under $2 billion.
$2 billion? So wouldn't that be about like $20 million per county?
Well, you're not looking at it like a politician.
Oh. I'm looking at it like a taxpayer. Well, I was just thinking, like, there's had to have been some pressure on the state government to say, hey, these counties are facing this much deficit. why can't we just give the money that the state has to the individual county on the basis of its deficit to help it out? Like, is that a possibility?
Not likely. And I want to be I want to make sure I'm clear here. While the reserve is $2 billion, that is a function of accounting. That doesn't mean that there are actually $2 billion sitting in a vault somewhere. The actual excess money that the state has and could give to a county, for instance, is in the neighborhood of about $100 million. And so that's not to say that the state is inaccurate or wrong. We do have a $2 billion surplus. We will have that much more in accounting at the end of the year than we have as far as what we're appropriating. But the actual cash money is $100 million or so. And it's, the state keeps that for the ability for it to continue to function if the economy is, falters again or the revenue doesn't come in. And so, the state's got to run too. I think you raise a very interesting question, and it goes right to the heart of the political policy questions that are at the core of what all of us are talking about, and that is who gets to determine how much money is raised and then how that is distributed. And there's not a clear path between the local governments and the state government. It's connected. And in many cases, if the local government wants to do something, it has to have the permission of the state government. And because of many of the things that Julia talked about, if you look at districts, communities of interest are fractured. The state senator who represents my area represents part of Meridian Kessler neighborhood, northwest in Marion County, and all the way into northeast Marion County and southeast Hamilton County. There are many school districts in that area. There are many different neighborhoods. There are many different interests. And so when a particular issue comes up for that legislator, which community of interest does he fall in? And where does he cast that vote? And I think that's a big problem for public policy when it comes to how you tax and then how you spend that money. So it's the $2 billion gets bandied about. You'll hear a lot about it next year. It's not that simple. And the biggest problem I see is the lack of freedom for local governments to determine their own tax and spend policy.
Thank you.
The question that I'd like to ask is, would it be possible to do a survey question to ask if citizens feel they are getting value from taxes paid? And I think this would give us a true understanding of how people relate themselves to the taxes that they pay. Are we getting value for the taxes we paid to the extent that we pay them?
Who would like to take that? I'll do it. I do. One of the things that I think would be incredibly interesting if we could put numbers to it, and I'll look at John because he's a numbers guy, although Troy's pretty much a numbers guy too. If you as a taxpayer and a homeowner started to pay out of pocket for all of the services that we take for granted that we get from government. Everything from we have to hire our own scavenger service to pick up the garbage, and we have to, I don't know how you would value paving our own streets, but I think it would be incredibly helpful if citizens saw the value that they're getting for their tax dollars, because I think there is a tendency that we all have. John mentioned it. You know, well, I don't like to pay all these taxes, and what am I really getting for that? For a little while with our property tax bill, the treasurer, I guess it was putting in a little sort of difficult to read note, but the idea was good. Here's what these taxes pay for. I think we need to do, or our government needs to do a great deal more of that. This is how much of your tax dollars is spent for a police officer who patrols your neighborhood. This is how much of your tax dollar is spent picking up the garbage so that public health doesn't suffer when your neighbor decides not to have the scavenger service, and so forth. So I think it's a very good idea to start to put out the kind of information, again, that allows citizens to evaluate what their taxes go for and what kinds of value they're getting from it. So anybody else want to, Julia?
I think that's the transparency piece. You know, for too long in Indianapolis, all of those details have been hidden from view. But you're right, if you want people to, for example, should we ever elect a politician here who would have the courage to propose a tax increase, you know, to sell that, you're going to have to show people, well, you know, here are our books. So I think it's been smoke and mirrors for a long time in Indianapolis. We've had difficulty getting basic financial information. So again, I hate to refer back to the state all the time, but that's sort of where I spend most of my time thinking about policy. I will say that there has been an effort at the state level. There's this thing called the Transparency Portal. And so there's an awful lot of very detailed information that you can get in the comfort of your home, behind your computer, about contracts and just basic, you know, nuts and bolts information about what the state is spending its money on. There has been some discussion by one of the candidates about putting that kind of information up on the county's website, and certainly that would be a welcome addition to the information that citizens have access to.
Yes.
Hi, Eric Barnett. I have a question about abandoned property, both in commercial and in residential areas. It's pretty prevalent problem across large parts of the city. What kind of effects will that have on us, and are there positive ways we can affect that? In addition, what is the fiscal effect if we are able to remedy that situation?
Well, I can talk about vacant housing somewhat, is that, as I was telling you earlier, in some of our toughest areas, 25 to 35% of the homes are vacant. And around those homes, a lot of trash and debris, quality of life. As a result, home values have been depressed in those areas. There is some movement. I know code enforcement, that's another section of city government, but code enforcement had actually gone into some of these trouble areas, and they went through with one purpose in mind, is to check the homes and see if they could be rehabilitated or if they need to be torn down. And I haven't gotten the numbers back on that yet, but they were trying to do that because we have partners that are wanting to come in and rehab homes and establish home ownership in some of these areas and start to turn those neighborhoods around. But we have so many vacant homes in so many different areas of the community, it's almost to the point we're going to have to take one area at a time and deal with that comprehensively. Did not look anything at some of the industrial sites and former industrial sites. We've been more focused within public safety in the neighborhoods, because we know that in the neighborhoods, some of these vacant homes, people are using them for gambling homes, they're using them for illegal drug, and some people are living in the homes because they have nowhere else to live. So a tremendous amount of issues. Now, you start fixing some of those homes up, there's a couple of things that, you know, success breeds success. You get a group of individuals like Purposeful Design, that they have individuals that were homeless, and many of them were heroin addicts, and they're teaching them skills on how to build furniture, and a lot of them are being employed now in the city. That's a step in the right direction. They are looking at the potential of going into some of these vacant homes with some funders, working on a home, teaching basic skills, selling that home to maybe one of them So now they're able to get their life back on the right track. So not only do you have the added benefit of a home off the rolls of being vacant, but someone there with some skills that's been able to get employment, and one by one you start turning that neighborhood around because you're giving people opportunities.
Generally speaking, from a fiscal perspective, certainly on the residential side, every one of those homes that becomes occupied and redeveloped produces additional assessed valuation. And as we talked about earlier, that's the surest way for the county to collect more money in property taxes, to have more of those homes redeveloped and occupied. The commercial side's a little more difficult because there are a lot of reasons for dislocation and for commercial properties to become vacant. We've seen a lot of former industrial manufacturing sites go vacant because the companies have stopped production in those places. Those are more difficult to refill, and often when they're refilled, it's with a function that's different, that doesn't have the same tax implications on a positive. That just doesn't generate as much tax revenue as an industrial plant would. And the other problem on that side is we've had a lot of big box type stores or medium box size stores either leave or open someplace else and then leave the other property behind, which then eventually falls off the tax rolls. And it's very difficult, again, to make those properties useful and productive from a tax perspective. So it's, from a fiscal perspective, the residential side will have more activity and probably regenerate more quickly, but it won't have the same positive fiscal impact that if we could do on the industrial side, the same kind of thing. That's just a very difficult thing to do, and often those buildings are torn down, go away, and then hopefully at some point that area is redeveloped into something else.
Sure.
Well, that is outside my scope. Most of our employees make the minimum wage, so it wouldn't have an adverse effect. But I think that what it would do crime-wise, in some cases, that it gives younger people an opportunity to make enough money to do the things that they want to do and need to do. It provides some hope for individuals. Economically, what does that do overall? I'll leave that to John because I'll get myself in trouble.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'll step in to do. Well, you know, Bob, obviously an increase in the minimum wage would mean an increase in the amount of money that's being earned in Marion County. And so the more money that's earned in the county means that more income tax will be collected. You know, the counter to that is there is some concern that you would lose money on the corporate side or the business side in terms of some taxes. That's not as likely. More likely, the profit margins of those companies would be squeezed. So the tax implication would be mostly positive. You know, it's a tough sell to corporations to give up some of their property or some of their profit in order to pay more wages, but that's one of those questions where, you know, you have to make that kind of a judgment, and that's why we elect people to do these things. So it would have a positive effect in terms of the amount of tax collected in Marion County.
We have,
Really, we were told at the last meeting, the first meeting of this series, that Indiana state law requires that all minimum wage here cannot be set locally and is tied to the federal minimum wage, that it's in our Constitution or something. So it doesn't really sound like it's a local decision unless people are going to band together and try to get the Constitution changed. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's what came out of the last meeting.
what is correct is that we are not a home rule state, which means that we pretty much have to go to the legislature and beg to do pretty much anything. So I'm sure you're right. Anybody have a contrary?
I would just note that, you know, any business is free to pay whatever it wants to pay.
Oh, sure.
According, you know, so it's not bound to pay the minimum. You know, if the market dictates, it can pay more. And we have examples of that. But Sheila's right. If the legislature doesn't see fit, then the minimum won't be raised. But that doesn't preclude somebody from paying more because they value the employee that they have and want to invest in them.
Yes. Are there any mayoral debates scheduled?
There are at least 2 more coming, and I'm sorry I can't tell you when they are. I know one will be on Wish TV on a Friday night for 30 minutes. That ought to be an exciting slugfest. And I don't know when the other one is. I'm sorry, I don't know. But they were very difficult to get organized.
How can we decide who to vote for when we don't, I mean, we see Joe Hogstead on the TV, but how are we supposed to decide who to vote for mayor?
I would say call the campaigns and invite them to your neighborhood. Ask them to come out and speak. I mean, I was a director of public safety. I wasn't an elected official, but anytime I was invited to attend a neighborhood function, I needed to be there. That was my responsibility as the director of public safety. Now, it's a little late towards the election, and it may be tough, but you could have a policy discussion with someone from one of their staffs if they couldn't make it, and I can't imagine a person running for office that has an opportunity to speak to residents wouldn't take them up on that.
Well, where is the responsibility of the 2 parties in this?
Well, that's where I'm going to try my best not to get myself in trouble, but
Julie may
I
have
have worked in government for 26 years, and I don't have a lot of faith in government. I have a faith in government when the community and the residents hold it accountable. That's when I have a faith in government because that's how it was set up. So, but that's where you get a few people that are meeting and talking and generating information, generating discussion, putting things on Facebook. And I can tell you, I've literally been in elected officials' offices and worked there when 6 citizens in a major metropolitan area called to complain about something, and policy changes over 6 people calling their phone number. Well, right.
Julia?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think that too many voters feel the way that you do, that there is absolutely a void. Absent paid commercials, it's difficult to even know who is running for office in our county. I think the media bears some responsibility. I think that there's less and less hard news. We know more about the Colts and, you know, every injury that any player on that team has, but we know very little about the folks who want to run our community. I would contact the Indianapolis Star. We're down to 1 major newspaper and tell them they are not adequately covering this election. I would also urge you to contact the major television stations, radio stations. We aren't having enough community conversations, and I think the media bears a tremendous amount of responsibility here, and they're simply not stepping up to the plate. It is tremendously difficult as an individual citizen to seek information. I would encourage you to, organizations that you trust, that you see as like-minded, contact them to see if they've had any interaction with the candidates that they could pass along to you. But you're right. It is extremely difficult for voters in our community to make informed decisions, and it's going to take a community effort to change that.
But of course, we do have a new reporter on the beer beat. And now I'm sorry. I'm a little bitter about that. Ann?
Have both of the candidates put out anything close to what Bart Peterson did with the Peterson Plan, which covered what he hoped to achieve in the next during his term.
I do know that there's plans for public safety, there's plans for housing, there's education plans that both candidates have talked about. Some are more detailed than others, that you can certainly call their campaign and get that information or go to their website. But I will say there's not the vigorous discussion regarding some of the systemic issues we're dealing with as a community, and that's something that I think we would all like to see more of.
Well, I think one of the reasons is that, you know, we've got a well-funded candidate for mayor and then another candidate that's not that well-funded. It's difficult without money to get your message out. So some big cities, for example, Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually funds municipal elections with public money. They say that, you know,
They have
it's
public money?
public
Okay.
money, yeah. Tax dollars are actually spent in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to help voters make informed decisions. So as long as we treat political office like, you know, toothpaste or anything else that we want to advertise, we're going to have significant voids in the amount of information available.
My question is for Troy. I'm listening to the mayoral candidates talk about more officers, cameras on officers, even more street lights, but I don't hear anyone talking about guns and getting them off the street.
Right. Well, let me answer that first by some of the proposals for police officers, about $18 million. The police department has a contract open negotiation. If they get a 3% raise, that's another $3.8 million for police. The fire department has a clause in their contract that they get equal pay, so that's about $1.6 million. The money keeps stacking up. That's a lot of money. We have to have that discussion. How do you pay for it? In regards to guns, we have too many individuals that have weapons that shouldn't have weapons. And what I mean by that is when you look at our individuals that have committed homicides last year, almost 50% of those have previous gun charges using a weapon. We have to be serious about charging people appropriately that are using weapons in crime. When you introduce a weapon into a crime, it is a deadly encounter, and we are letting too many people out with weapons too soon, and it's resulting in too many people dying in our cities. That discussion needs to continue. It usually devolves into a Second Amendment debate, but what I'm talking about is something I think most good people and most Hoosiers, regardless of where they are, would support prosecuting someone to the fullest extent of law that uses a weapon in a crime of violence. We're talking about a handful of individuals. I am not a proponent of mass incarceration. I think there's too many people in jail that don't need to be in jail, but when it comes to a weapon, that's different, and we need to treat it differently. We have an individual in this city that shot 9 human beings at Black Expo. 9 human beings. Because no one died, he ended up getting 8 years in prison. He served 2.5 years.
Oh.
Police department was involved in a police pursuit, and that individual was in the car, and there was a weapon in the car, and go figure, they were robbery suspects. He's back in prison. Mr. Curry did a tremendous job in revoking his probation. The North End home invasion, another gun crime. One of the 26 years, I've never read a crime report that was horrific as that one. Terrible. The individual that was a mastermind of that home invasion had been sentenced in this state to 16 years in prison for criminal confinement, which is basically keeping someone hostage with a weapon, robbery. He was out in 763 days. We have to have that conversation about holding people accountable with guns. Now, there's a lot of guns in the state of Indiana. There's got to be a conversation about what type is appropriate, what we feel about handguns, what we feel about assault rifles, but that is a community, that's a community discussion that has to be had, and we have to have the right leadership that can have a conversation without getting in arguments over it.
I'll weigh in briefly as well that there's increasing dialogue nationally about violence as a public health issue and gun violence specifically as a public health issue. And so I think that's another opportunity before us is to begin, going back to the health and all policies, how we look at those connections, how we look at the systemic issues that contribute and approaching it differently than we have in the past.
I think we have time for
I have a
one or two
question.
more.
I have one. Can you talk about the resistance of people who work in Marion County but don't live in Marion County and paying those taxes? And are there any kind of figures to what that amounts to?
I don't have those figures at the top of my head, and I'm sorry for that. I just can't recite them to you. And I don't think it's the taxpayer that has any resistance to the tax, because we're really not talking about a change in the amount that people pay, but the change in how it's distributed. And so the resistance comes from people who stand to lose revenue if, another area, Marion County, gains revenue. That's the policy challenge for the legislature, is to find out a way to mitigate that difference and to try to bring benefit to areas that provide services and a place for people to be, but don't get anything for that. We've heard also, a large portion of Center Township, for instance, is off the tax rolls because it's either a government or religious or not-for-profit property, and so it doesn't pay property taxes. There's been some discussion about having payments in lieu of taxes to help cover some of the services like public safety, water, sewer, things like that are provided as well. So I can't give you the numbers that you seek, but I do think that those discussions are starting to gain some momentum, and that I think that there's some active talk about finding solutions so that, for instance, Hamilton County, where a number of people come to work in Marion County and take that revenue back to Hamilton County, would not necessarily lose tax revenue, but would allow Marion County to gain. And I'm not sure exactly how that'll happen, but I think that that's some of the discussion that's going on right now.
I can quote Ryan Vaughn, who was the chief of staff for Mayor Ballard until about 6 months ago. He did a presentation, and if I remember correctly, John, he said that if the city of Indianapolis captured 25% of the salaries and the taxes that people that work here and move and go back to their communities, if we just captured 25%, that we would have a surplus in the city. And let's remember, and a couple things as we talk about money, a couple things I think is important. The city's doing very well in a lot of respect. Look at all the building that's going on, the home ownership. There's good things happening in the city. The other part of that is that while good things are going on, that still means you need more public safety, you need more roadways, you need all the things. So it's good. And then the other thing, and I don't want to give a pass, since I was in government and we put all of our business plans, everything online. I love the accountability part of government and making people do that. But at the end of the day, let's not take for granted that government's as efficient as it can be. Let's make sure that we're holding our elected officials and those appointed to a higher level and making sure that they're spending money wisely. And how do we do that? We get informed. We're an informed electorate. We get involved. There's a lot of committee meetings. We're talking about multi-million-dollar programs. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars invested, and there's no one there from the public to listen to the debate. The city has to do a better job promoting that. We have to do a better job of vetting that out, making sure that contracts are spent wisely, that money's spent wisely, and that we're saving money when we can.
Last question.
In terms of a lot of discussion, first off, thank you for hosting a public forum. Observation two, Julie, you talked about transparency, you talked about the media not covering, and that comes back to us. The Star is running the stories that people read, and the news media is carrying the stories that we watch. And so the civic lethargy that our community has been paralyzed by is in a large result of our inactivity and expecting others to do the work for us. And I think that you're to be applauded to be here. I also find it interesting that we're stigmatized by 104, 105, whatever the homicide rate is. But my understanding is that an issue that we're not discussing is that the heroin deaths in our county, we're in the 10th month of homicide. But if we were to tally up what's happening in the heroin overdoses, that number would trump that by a significant amount, and we're not even having those conversations. So I think this the civic conversation needs to address not Band-Aids, but really these root causes in a much more complex conversation like this. So I applaud you for creating a civil opportunity to have conversation around difficult conversations, that there are no simple answers.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and please vote. We will see. Our next, the third and final presentation in this series will be on October 20th, same time, same place. And we will hear from the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee, which has been doing a lengthy study now of where the citizens of this community want to see Indianapolis in the year 2020. So I hope you all come back for that, and I hope you drag 3 friends with you. And thank you for coming.